And I'd always thought like I would never be the person to fall prey to someone who was manipulative or abusive or coercive. But the reality is, I did. And I think that really drove an understanding in me that anyone can fall prey to abuse.
I can make it through the day when you're with me on the way.
Happen to be the advocate on duty. And as we're walking through this safety plan, one of the questions is, why do you want to drop the Danko?
I can
And her
make
answer
it
to me
through the
was because God would
night
want me to reconcile with my
when
husband.
I'm
Now, keep
clinging
in
to
mind,
your
this woman
love.
had been beat literally within almost an inch of her life and tossed down some stairs. I mean, she had been in the ICU.
For
And
you
she believed that
are
God wanted her to go back to someone who had tried to kill her.
always, always with me. For you are always,
But
always.
it's wild. And I mean, I think when we start understanding the magnitude of this issue, we have to admit that that's going on inside of our churches. That's going on inside of Christian marriages, just statistically. And there really is no statistical difference between Christian marriages and secular marriages. It happens across the board. If anything, Christian victims tend to stay longer in abusive situations than those in secular
You
settings.
speak peace in every breath. For you are always,
Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Laura Teen. I'm a board member with GRACE, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. And the mission of GRACE is to empower Christian communities to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. And part of how we're doing that is offering these GRACE Live conversations periodically. Our YouTube channel is a great place to find some of those conversations from the past. But today, our conversation is around the topic of intimate partner violence. And I'm welcoming our guest speaker with us today, Hannah Fordyce. Hi, Hannah.
Hi.
Hannah and I are going to have a conversation around intimate partner violence and some dynamics around this issue in the faith community. We're going to have a little bit of time for questions at the end, hopefully. So if you do have a question that you'd like for us to touch on and address, we encourage you to click the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen and put your question there. If you submit a question during our conversation that gets covered by our content, we'll go ahead and mark that answered, but definitely feel free to follow up with us if you don't feel your question was helpfully addressed during our time today. So I think that covers kind of all of our general announcements at the beginning. Again, this talk is recorded, so you will have the chance to view it later, to share it with friends or other folks in your own communities as appropriate. And that will be available on our YouTube channel, typically a few days after the event is live. So, all right. Let's get started. Hannah, we're so happy that you are able to be with us. December is such a busy month. So I know sometimes it can be hard to navigate all the different things on the December calendar, but we're so glad that you're here. Hannah Fordyce is with House of Faith and Freedom. And Hannah, I'd love for you just to take a few minutes here at the beginning to share with everybody a little bit about yourself, or anything you'd like everyone to know about House of Faith and Freedom, and a little bit about what brought you into this work.
Yeah, for sure. So I think for most advocates or most people who end up working in the field of abuse, the reason you get into this work is either due to personal experience or due to exposure to someone who's had personal experience. And for me, it was a little bit of both of those things. So in brief, when I was in high school, I dated a guy for a couple of years who was abusive, and he was from another Christian family that was in ministry. My dad was a pastor. And I was just very ill prepared to
Mm,
understand that the relationship I was in was abusive because I just grown up in a family where that wasn't the context, right? My parents had a really lovely marriage that was very honoring. And And we just didn't have a lot of conversations about what sort of the red and yellow flags were to look for in a relationship. And I'd always thought like I would never be the person to fall prey to someone who was manipulative or abusive or coercive. But the reality is, I did. And I think that really drove an understanding in me that anyone can fall prey to abuse. Like anyone can. And around this time, I was starting to head into college. And in our church, we actually had a woman show up and disclose that she had gone through an extremely physically violent relationship and had escaped with her children. And she showed up at our church sort of unannounced. My mom worked in Christian radio, and so she'd heard my mom on air and just showed up and disclosed her story. So our church and our family really walked with her through this long, extensive court process, through both criminal cases, through the divorce, through a termination of parental rights. It was very long and messy. So both of these situations happened very close together for me. And I was studying psychology in my undergrad at the University of Minnesota Duluth and ended up getting an internship with our local domestic violence agency in legal advocacy. So working more on the court side of advocacy. During that time period, I had a woman come in to our agency who wanted to go through a safety plan. And the reason was she had had a criminal case that was active in the court system. And the judge had put in place something called a DANCO in the state of Minnesota, which is a domestic abuse no contact order. And she wanted to have that removed. But the judge in that jurisdiction specifically required that anyone who wanted to drop a DANCO come into our organization and go through safety plans so that there was some kind of um, safeguarding happening before they would consider allowing the couple to reconcile. So she comes and sits down with me. I happen to be the advocate on duty. And as we're walking through this safety plan, one of the questions is, why do you want to drop the DANCO? And her answer to me was because God would want me to reconcile with my husband. Now, keep in mind, this woman had been beat literally within almost an inch of her life and tossed down some stairs. I mean, she had been in the ICU and she believed that God wanted her to go back to someone who had tried to kill her. And like I was so unprepared. Undergraduate Hannah in college was just so unprepared for that answer. And then when I went on and got my master's degree in something called human services forensic behavioral health, which is a really long mouthful, but essentially intersection between mental health and the law. And and I got my master's degree and I started working more in the field of advocacy, both running a crisis line and doing some work in the court system. And this woman's story was just echoed over and over and over and over and over again in all of these victims and survivors I was working with who had been told by their churches to go back or to submit more or to pray about it. And it was breaking my heart because I had seen it in my childhood how the church could come around someone, how they could provide safety and support and community and a place of healing. And that just wasn't happening. And I don't think it was malintention on the part of the church. I think it was just lack of information, lack of knowledge. And so that was really the driving force behind starting House of Faith and Freedom was how do we bring these techniques, these tools of advocacy that I was teaching in a secular setting into the church? How do we marry this with the theology of the gospel?
As you said, often the reason why so many of us get into this work is personal experience or professional experience or exposure. And I think there's also just this motivation and desire on a lot of our parts that the church understand more fully and in a better way, what intimate partner violence is, what it involves, how to help, how to support, how not how not to support. And so I'm really excited that we're going to be able to have this conversation today and really kind of piece out some of this together. I think some people are probably wondering, what is a definition for intimate partner violence? What's the difference between that and domestic violence or other forms of abuse? What is a working definition that you use when talking about intimate partner violence?
For sure. So domestic abuse or domestic violence, those are often used pretty interchangeably, and they're kind of the umbrella term.
Okay.
So that's like any household member or family member or past romantic partners is like the big term. Intimate partner violence is when we narrow that down to a pattern of behaviors used by one romantic partner against the other to maintain power and control. And this may include physical and sexual assault or violence, but it doesn't necessarily always. It can include that coercion, the power differential that
Mhm.
really tends to exist and create this culture of oppression in the relationship.
Mm. And what are some of the things statistically or otherwise that we know about people who are most at risk or some of what are some of the stats and information out there around intimate partner violence?
Yes, I think one of the really fascinating things about our evolving knowledge about intimate partner violence, or IPV, I might shorten it
Sure.
occasionally, is that it actually there is no typical abuser or victim.
Mhm.
And this has really grown in our understanding since like, maybe
Mhm.
the 80s when we started really talking about intimate partner violence and it was considered battering, which is like physical and
Mm.
sexual violence only. And as we've expanded that definition to understand this power differential, the types of coercion and psychological and spiritual violence that can occur in a relationship, it's really broadened our understanding of who's affected and impacted by it.
Mm.
So the CDC puts out every several years, they put out a report, and we can put the link to that report as well in the chat, that gives a lot of statistics around intimate partner violence. So right now, I think one of the most fascinating ones in their most recent version that was released in 2018, but it's based off information from 2015, is that 36% of women will experience physical sexual violence or stalking from an intimate partner in their lifetime, and
Mm.
33.6% of men. So it's really close. We're like within 3%
Mm.
between men and women for physical and sexual violence and stalking. If we
Mm.
move that into severe physical violence, women, 21% of women, men, 15%. Like
Mm.
it is a staggering number. When you widen that out into the psychological abuse, we're talking 50%. 50% of both men and women. And that's sort of the generalized estimate between the last two CDC reports. They both float somewhere around 51 or 48%.
Mm.
But
Mhm.
it's wild. And I mean, I think when we start understanding the magnitude of this issue, we have to admit that that's going on inside of our churches. That's going on inside of Christian marriages, just statistically. And there really is no statistical difference between
Mm.
Christian marriages and secular marriages. It happens across the board. If anything, Christian victims tend to stay longer in abusive situations than those in secular settings.
And it's more underreported or misdiagnosed, in
Absolutely.
communities where um, it's not something people talk about, or maybe, with the misuse and manipulation of sacred texts and scripture, people can feel very justified in their behavior, and then victims feel um, that they don't really have any recourse. And so why
Mhm.
talk about it? Why bring it to someone's attention?
Yeah, and I think too, we have this desire, rightfully
Mhm.
so, in the church where we really value and cherish marriage. And that's a
Mm.
great thing. Covenant marriages are beautiful and they should be cherished and they should be preserved.
Mhm.
But I think that can also lead the church sometimes to put preservation of the marriage above everything else, including the safety of the individuals in the marriage. And I think
Mhm.
it was, oh, I cannot remember who says this quote, but there's a quote from an abuse expert that talks about how like Christ did not die for marriages. He
Mm.
died for individuals. He died for people. And
Mm.
so we have to start moving our mentality as the church away from preserve the marriage at all costs into safety before all else when we're dealing with
Mhm.
abuse.
Mhm. And that can be really challenging if a church feels ill-equipped, right,
Mhm.
to navigate what can be some really tricky dynamics and situations around that, which is really one of the reasons why we're having this conversation, right? Is that there is such amazing potential for the church to show up well, if well equipped, to help and support those affected by IPV and other, and other forms of abuse and neglect as well. Um, when we think about some of the things that are commonalities or common dynamics around IPV, what are some of the things that are really challenging? There are things more generally challenging just in our culture overall, but also maybe some things particular to faith community, some misconceptions and errors that we often see around IPV.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one, both culturally and inside of the church, is going to be just assuming it doesn't happen.
Right.
Um, right. If we don't understand that this is something that's very common, it's not a fringe issue, it's something that's just statistically occurring, we don't address it. And ultimately, cultures where there's silence around this issue aren't safe cultures. I sort of think about the idea that in order to become someone who's growing in righteousness, you need to proactively be moving towards righteousness. And it's similar when we think about the idea of creating safe cultures. You have
Mm,
to proactively develop a safe culture inside of your church. It doesn't magically happen. It's not something that you can assume, oh, we would know what to do, for
mm,
that situation to arise if you haven't prepared for it. When someone comes forward and discloses, if you haven't proactively prepared, you're going to react out of just panic, right?
right.
And rarely when we're reacting to something are we having the best response we could. So that sort of
Mhm.
moves us into one of the next errors, which I think is just lack of preparation.
Mm,
Um, when we're not trained, when we don't pay attention, when we don't understand the roots of abuse, what causes it, what it looks like, what those red flags are, we're going to miss it. We're going to not see when it's happening. We're going to misdiagnose it as a marriage issue, not as a personal sin issue. And the way that you're going to treat abuse and the way that you're going to treat a marriage problem or a relationship problem are really, really different. For example,
mm,
marriage counseling. Marriage counseling is really effective. Couples counseling has been shown to be incredibly effective. And I want to say it was like two-thirds of marriages it can help. The other third often has to do with abuse cases.
mm.
Marriage counseling is not effective in abuse. In fact, it's dangerous. This
Yes.
is for several different reasons. One of them being the victim is essentially gagged inside of a marriage counseling setting because the partner with more power is there. And so anything they say, they might be punished at home for. We've also got the reality that neutrality always helps the oppressor, never the oppressed. That situation in marriage counseling, the counselor is trying to be neutral.
Mm,
So if you're in that situation, you're inherently supporting the person with more power. So I think that's one of the big issues. Also, that overemphasis on the marriage. We already talked about that. That can really cause
mm,
safety concerns over time, as well as sort of re-victimizing victims unintentionally. And then I
mm,
think a big, big, big one in the church setting is some of our theology that can be taken out of context and
mm,
used to allow abuse to continue. And some of those can be done with such good intentions and just cause wild harm still. I'm thinking specifically about the issue of forgiveness
mm,
and the
mhm,
issue of remorse and repentance, and then reconciliation as sort of the outcome of these things. Like we want to make that formulaic. We want to say, victim, you need to forgive, offender, you need to look sorry, and then put it back together, right? Good as new. Your
mhm,
marriage is fixed. And that's not how it works. When
mhm,
we think about those theological issues, they're so much more complex and so much more needs to go into our understanding of what those look like when you're dealing with a habitual sin that's been
mhm,
occurring over a very long time period and has caused a lot of sustained harm, you know?
mm,
And it's not going to be
mhm,
as simple as like sort of our childlike understanding often of you did something wrong, go say you're sorry, and now things go back to normal.
mhm. I think, a point of reflection, for any community, not just faith community, is, how have we unintentionally, systemically enabled instead of enabled those who are perpetuating IPV instead of, how have we supported? How have we how have we held those who are offending accountable? How have we supported those who have been harmed? And not just as a measure of like, oh, let's just focus on all the negative, but when we can acknowledge that with humility, we can then say, okay, so now we have an opportunity to do better, right? We know better, we can do better. And let's collaborate. Like, let's bring in Hannah from House of Faith and Freedom. Let's bring in a local DV expert, collaborate with law enforcement, like hear about how some of the people local to our congregations and our institutions experience the faith community and how supportive they are, or not, and how we can do better. What are some of the ways that maybe we unwittingly interfere in investigations of this when we shouldn't? What are some of the ways that we can collaborate with the mental health community around providing appropriate support, and accountability? I think there's a lot of opportunity when we can take a look inward and say, okay, where maybe we have not done well with this in the past, what are the opportunities in front of us to do better going forward? And sometimes that means accountability as well, for faith communities, but primarily, ultimately, like you were saying earlier, creating a safer place for those who are experiencing harm is such an important part of the care and mission of the church.
Yeah, and I absolutely love what you said there as far as how can we do better? And that's the posture that I know we take. I know that's a posture Grace takes. Like, it's not about how do I shame the church into the ground for
Right.
this issue or for mishandling this issue. It's like we have an opportunity. We have
Mm,
this incredible opportunity to support victims and survivors, to show the hands and feet of Christ, not only to them, but to the organizations that work with them. I mean, one
mm,
of the very interesting things that I experienced when I worked in the nonprofit world, when I worked in sort of the government sector, is that there's a very negative opinion of the church in general. And I think a lot of it was because I was not the only advocate receiving those
mm, mm,
stories from victims and
mm,
survivors. And so there's a lot of frustration that exists in those realms around how the church engages with this issue. But
mm.
realistically, the church has been uniquely positioned to
Mm.
help meet a need that no nonprofit, no government agency can meet, which
Yes.
is long-term support and
Yes.
community, right? Like there's not enough manpower, there's not enough resources, there's not enough money for those agencies to provide community for
Right.
the long haul. And when
Hmm.
we're talking recovery from trauma and abuse, we're talking years and years and years of recovery and ever shifting needs, right?
Right.
The church is perfectly positioned to provide that. It's literally what we're called to do as the body of Christ is be that wraparound community, be that wraparound care. So if we could step in and become trained, become educated, be motivated to deal with this issue and create safe spaces, we could really be this missing puzzle piece
Hmm.
inside sort of the whole network that helps to deal with the issue of abuse. And that ties perfectly into what you were saying before, which is also realize you are one piece. I mean, I think we
Right.
have to take a stand and be like, yes, we want to do our piece very well. We want to provide that community well, that long-term support well. But there are all these other pieces. Like you
Right.
don't have to be the end all be all. We're not saying every church needs to be perfectly equipped to do every aspect of advocacy. It's how do you know how to do just enough that you can get them to the right places without causing more harm. I
Mhm.
often use the analogy of sort of an emergency room.
Mm,
Like the church is an emergency room in a lot of ways. You have people coming in every single Sunday who have different hurts, different
mm,
griefs, traumas, addictions, issues they're dealing with, perpetual sin issues, like all of those things, they're all coming in. And
mm.
you, as an ER doctor, cannot deal with every trauma that comes through the doors. you can learn how to triage those things,
Mhm.
right? You know how to deal with
Mhm.
it in the emergency moment and then get them to a specialist, right?
Mm.
And that's sort of what the church should be doing, is like, how do we know enough in each one of these areas that we don't cause more harm and that we're able to triage effectively to the right
Mhm.
places so that they
Mhm.
get the help that they need?
Yeah. And, from the ER, you also typically get a lot of referrals, right? So
Mhm.
also like to connect people with resources and referrals to folks who specialize, right? Like if you go into the ER and you end up finding out, oh, there's a neurological issue, well, let's send them to neurology. But the rest of the medical team is also participating in that care. I love that. I love that analogy, Hannah. Um, let's, let's take a second also to talk about how one of the big aspects of intimate partner violence, but really a lot of interpersonal violent dynamics, is that in times of stress, um, people are at higher risk, right, for harm because of the element of power and control that comes into play here, and how, the holidays, which are upon us, they're already here. We can't even say they're coming up. They're already here, and there's more to come. The holidays are often a time of stress, right? So what does that mean for folks um who are under stress? What does that mean for IPV over the holidays?
For sure. So stress amplifies
Mm-hmm.
our responses,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is basically what you said there. And I think when we're thinking about abuse specifically, abusers use abusive tactics as a way to not only gain power and control, but also as a coping mechanism for a feeling
Mm-hmm.
of powerlessness or a feeling of being out of control. The holidays often make people feel out of control. And for someone who's abusive, who maybe keeps a very tight rein on their home life, and that's sort of the dominion in which they have the most control because they're using the most abusive tactics there, having external factors come in, extended family, other systems that are interacting, can make them feel like they're losing that control. And so abuse can really ramp up around the holidays. And we see that, I mean, we see that in police calls. They tend to go up around the holiday season as well for domestic assaults. Like, it is definitely a higher risk time period. Something I do want to mention around that, though, is I recently had it was a church leader that I was doing a training, and a church leader had said, okay, in this scenario we have where a husband shoved his wife, what if it was just because he was really stressed? Is that actually abusive? Right. And so I think we also have a tendency to want to use stress as an excuse for
Mm-hmm.
abusive behavior. Like, oh, it was just because it was a stressful time period. It's because it was the holidays. It was high stress. It was stressful at work. But the reality is, like, abuse can have explanations. There are no excuses for it,
Right.
right? And if you, especially when we're talking physical violence, when
Mm,
that ramps up or happens, you have to go, what's the culture in that relationship that made that a viable response to stress,
right.
right? Like,
Yeah.
what kind of power differential already existed in that relationship that would make someone think it was okay to shove their
Right.
spouse? Like, you
Right.
couldn't shove your coworker. Like, that's not what you do when you're stressed at work, because that's not the
Right.
culture in your workplace where you're
Right.
allowed to do that.
Yeah.
So it's really like a symptom, right? Where you go, okay, what's deeper, right? That's a time to examine that relationship and the power dynamics that are at play inside of it.
Right. So it's something that can be part of the context for behavior, but is not an excuse for behavior.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. I want to go back just quickly to psychological abuse, that component of IPV, because I think, that statistic that about 50%, right, of folks will experience that, it's high, right? It's a high number. And also it's one of the harder forms to prove. Um, there are often not laws that hold people accountable criminally for that. And so I think it's also a trickier one for the church to recognize, right? I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, a little bit about what makes that, those tactics, the manipulation, the gaslighting, different things, the terrorizing emotionally. Like, what are some of those things that make it hard for the church to recognize psychological abuse as intimate partner violence?
For sure. I mean, a few things. I think again, we culturally have been slow to catch up
Mm,
on the idea that abuse is more than physical violence.
mm,
And so already there's a lack of looking for it. We're not paying attention for it. I think something else that can make it very challenging is obviously psychological abuse is psychological, so it's
mhm.
invisible from the outside a lot of
Right.
times. There's not the bruises, the lacerations, the broken bones. We don't have these
Mhm.
very clear-cut instances
Yes.
of physical abuse where you can say like, "Oh, I was punched, I was shoved, I was strangled." And there's not going to be those um, the criminal fallout for it. You're not going to be able to call 911 in the same way. And it can be very subtle. This is why I often use the term the culture of the relationship when I talk about abuse, because culture is something that's created through a million tiny things. It's
Mm,
not like one thing, it's all sorts
mhm,
of small things that create
mhm,
it. And when we look at abusive relationships where there's specifically that psychological or emotional abuse aspect, which is going to be every abusive relationship, by the
mhm,
way. It's just
mhm,
whether that escalates into physical or sexual violence in addition to the
mhm,
psychological.
mhm,
It's going to be nuanced and it's going to look different in each scenario. And so that's part of the challenge with it is over time, when someone has developed a culture where they're in power, to reinforce that culture, they can use very small things.
mm,
And so it can be a look, it can be the way that they say something, it can be the way that they intimidate, because there's so much history backing it up.
mm,
And so for someone
mhm,
outside of that relationship to look in and try to define what's happening there is almost impossible. I mean, I sometimes talk about this almost in a missions culture. Like if you're a missionary, you go on a missions trip to Guatemala for a week, you'll get a taste of the culture, but
mhm.
you're not going to understand the culture in the way that
Right.
someone who grew up and lived there their whole life does. And in the
Mhm,
same way, when you talk to a couple or you talk to a victim or survivor, you'll maybe get this little tiny flavor of what that culture of the relationship was, but you're never going to understand it like the person who's lived it. Um,
right.
so that's very challenging. I think another element to that, specifically for the church, is that abusive individuals they're good at chameleoning. They may change the way that they behave in different settings depending on what's
Mhm.
going to give them the most sense of power and control. So in the
What's gonna
home
make
life,
them look good. Yeah.
yeah. So in the home life, that might be dominance,
Mhm,
but in a public setting or in a church
mm,
setting, they might perceive, oh, say the pastors or the church leaders as people who have power. And so they're
mhm,
going to like cozy up to that,
mm,
right? They're going to want to get closer to it because they sort of get by proxy power. And so
mhm.
their experience, the church's experience of that individual may look wildly different than
Yes.
the spouse's experience of that individual. And that is
Right.
very hard for us to reconcile, because we're
Yes.
always viewing it through our lens. And so when they come forward and say, this is happening in my home, and
Mhm,
especially if it's psychological and they can't give you a like, here's the bruises on my arm to prove it,
mhm,
you're going to be like, well, are you just exaggerating?
mhm.
If it's just a marriage issue that you're having some more problems with and you're just,
Right,
you're making it bigger than it is. Like we
right.
have this internal skepticism because
Mhm,
we're already biased to view them in a positive light.
mhm. And sometimes the bias is, you know, toward the person being harmed is like, oh, they're being incongruent. There's something wrong with them. But why do we not question more the
Mhm.
person causing the harm? Like, I wonder if they're being incongruent here. Like, they're one
Yeah.
person at home, they're a different person on Sunday mornings or at the church deacon meeting or at the nonprofit, event. Um, and we don't seem to, I don't know, and maybe, it doesn't seem like we question that as much as we question, oh, this person's saying their experience is this, but our experience of this person is not that at all. We tend to center our experiences instead of centering the experience of the person who's experiencing harm.
100%. And I also think we have, and this is a great
Mm-hmm.
question I tend to ask in trainings, which is why do you think it is that
Mm-hmm.
we as people have an inherent internal skepticism? Like,
Mm-hmm.
why do we, when we hear a disclosure, want to err on the side of the oppressor?
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Like, why do we want to give them the benefit of the doubt instead of erring on the side of safety?
Mm-hmm.
And I think as the church, that's a really important question to consider because our
Right.
call as the church is always been to support the victims, the oppressed, the widow, the orphan, the poor, right? Like we're always supposed to be erring on this side. So why is it that we always want to err on the side of power? And I think there's all sorts of answers for that. And that's a deep internal searching kind of thing to do. Like, why am I
Right.
doing that specifically? And maybe it's my experience. Um,
Yeah.
also, maybe it's the reality that if this is abuse,
Mm.
that is what this is. It's going to be so messy. It's going to be
Mm.
so messy to deal with. And churches have this very unique experience among wider organized um, organizations or places that are going to deal with abuse or encounter it in the sense that they probably have a very established relationship with both people in the relationship.
Right.
And that gets hairy fast,
It
right?
does. And sometimes, going back to what you were saying about the culture of the relationship, there's also the faith community culture that can reinforce that dynamic,
Hmm.
right? Which is one of the important things to be able to acknowledge is, all theology, as our director Pete Singer says, has risks, right? So we have to acknowledge the risks of that theology and how that can potentially reinforce harmful behavior, right? But not just like Christian, all theology, right? All way of making meaning and understanding of our responsibilities, to God or a higher power. I mean, all of that. Everybody who says I believe something about this, um, you have to acknowledge the risk. And sometimes it's our faith community culture or our congregational culture and our theology that unwittingly reinforces what the person with power
Hmm.
in the relationship is doing. And it's so important that we understand how that happens psychologically. So thanks for expounding a little bit more on that.
Right. And I think, well, when we think about the risk, there's always risk
Right.
to belief one way or the other. It's
Yeah.
going to cost something, right? If you're
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah.
So which one has less cost?
Right.
Like I go, if you err on the side of believing a perpetrator,
Mm-hmm.
the cost is an enormous amount of continued harm. If
Mm.
you're on the side of supporting a victim,
Mm-hmm.
at least you're providing safety and security and those types of
Mm-hmm.
things, right? And
Mm-hmm.
eventually truth will come out throughout an investigation.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of like, which cost are you going to err on?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I know we have a couple questions, Hannah, around kind of, okay, so what do we do as a church? Like, what are some of the real practical applications of understanding more around this issue? How do we help people who disclose? What are some next steps? What are some of the policies maybe that we need to be thinking about? What kind of training do people need in faith communities around this? So let's take a few minutes and talk about, what are some of the ways that the church can help educate, recognize, and support um, around this issue.
Yeah. And that's a big question. You
Yeah,
know,
we'll
there's
we'll talk. We'll have a whole
at that
other
level.
hour just for that, right? But maybe just a couple practical things people can take away, and I know that people can always follow up if they need more information as well.
For sure. I think the first thing that I would say as like across the board that you could do today that would make your church a safer place is recognize that you're a part of the puzzle, but you are not the whole puzzle. And so
Mm,
find your resources, find your local resources
yes,
in advance.
yes.
And like don't just Google them, meet them. Go and
Mm,
actually have a conversation with your local advocacy agency, have a conversation with your
mm,
affordable housing agency, have a
mm,
conversation with counselors and therapists that are in your area
yes.
that understand abuse dynamics.
Mm,
And when you establish those relationships in advance, not only does that mean that you're going to know where to refer people,
Mm-hmm.
because there are experts out there who dedicated their lives and careers to this issue. So you don't have to know it all, you can refer to them.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have the benefit of knowing who to refer to. And also, you're going to have the benefit of establishing your church as the kind of place that
Mm-hmm.
cares for those community agencies. They're going to
Mm-hmm.
see, like, oh, and when we have a victim, or a survivor that we're working with who's struggling, who needs community, who's looking for somewhere to heal, we can refer them to your church because we have a good reputation established in the community.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say like the number one thing is figure out who's in your area and then establish some kind of relationship with them because
Yeah.
that's going to be that ongoing reciprocal relationship that's going to provide holistic support.
Mm.
Like don't make the mistake of thinking as the church you have to be the end all be all.
Right.
So that's a very big one. I'd say to move beyond that, training is a really big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, of course, like I offer training, so you can reach out to me if you're curious about that. I have both in-person training as well as virtual, self-paced online courses. Grace does safeguarding. I mean, there are a plethora of good resources that can help you understand the issue of abuse and the ways that the faith community can work through and deal with the complexities, the messiness, the hairiness of it. And that is sort of the first groundwork to making your church a safe place. And I would say don't make the error of having one single person in your church do that training. Like get your
Mm-hmm.
whole leadership trained.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because abuse victims do not disclose at convenient times and locations and to convenient people. They will
Right.
disclose in weird side places that you don't expect. And sometimes it's like very subtle. And
Mm-hmm.
if you don't understand abuse dynamics, you might not know that what's happening is a disclosure. And it's like this
Right.
opportunity to try to say, hey, we see you, that's not okay. We can
Mhm.
support you and help you. And if you want more, here's who to talk to. But
Yeah.
if you don't know to look for that,
Mm-hmm.
you're just going to shuffle it somewhere else.
Yeah.
So that's a big one too.
What if, so if there's let's just say, somebody in leadership at a congregation, so, receives a disclosure, whether it's an inconvenient or inconvenient, in a weird sidebar conversation, or maybe they're just noticing something. They pick up on something on their radar and their guts, like something feels off here, and maybe that, ends up evolving and they end up providing support to an individual who does end up disclosing that they're experiencing IPV, but maybe the leadership is a little bit unsure about the dynamics of like that person's choices about whether or not they stay or leave or what that looks like. And I think, there's always a question or two around the agency of the person who's been harmed and choices that they need to be able to make in the right timing around that. Could you share a little bit about that?
For sure. I mean, I think that often as church leaders, we have a tendency to want to tell people what to do. Like we want to rescue them,
Mm.
we want to save them.
Mm,
But that's not our job.
right.
And in any situation, but especially not in abuse. And this is an interesting one because a lot of times abuse victims and survivors, they've spent probably years in their current relationship. I've worked with victims who were in
Mm,
Christian marriages that were 10, 20, 30 years before they reached out and got help.
mm,
And in those relationships, everything in their life was controlled by
mm,
their
mm,
spouse. And so they weren't allowed to make decisions, or they were basically told through word or through action that they couldn't make good choices, that they weren't capable of making good choices. So a
mhm,
lot of times when they come to you for help, they're going to be like, tell me what to do. I don't know what to do.
mhm,
Resist that temptation. I mean,
mm.
unless it's a significant safety concern where like they need to be removed at that moment. I think the biggest thing is make yourself like a be an open door, not a closed door. Try to provide as many opportunities for them to make choices as possible. And a
Mhm,
big part of this is you don't want to move the power from the abuser to
mhm.
you. You don't now want to be the power player in that relationship. You want to help them regain their ability to make choices, their
Yes.
ability to move forward. And a lot of that regaining of voice is part of the healing that happens for abuse survivors, is
Mhm.
learning that they can make choices, that they're capable of it, that they can make good choices. And your job is just be a guide through that process, help them
Mhm.
think through and process and understand what options are available to them, what some of the pros and cons are. Another big thing with this, especially if we're talking about staying or leaving, and Leslie Vernick does a great job of talking about
Mhm.
staying well or leaving well. And sort of, there's not moralistic rights or wrongs here necessarily, especially when we're talking in abuse situations. And I'm not going to get into the divorce issue there. There's a lot of wonderful resources that address the issue of divorce. I think there's actually a past grace conversation that talks about it.
Mhm.
So we can reference that in the chat as well. But the idea being like, how do we support them into making the choice? Because if they don't make that choice, personally on a deep level, it's not going to stick.
Mhm.
Like it's a major choice about their life and they need to have ownership over that decision
Mhm.
because it will be hard if they stay in a relationship where there's unrepentant
Yes.
abuse happening. And it will be really hard if they leave
Yeah,
because
the risks are huge.
the risks are huge and like the long-term repercussions of if you have kids, being a single parent, trying to afford housing, trying to work. A lot of times abuse victims are not allowed to work outside of the home. So now trying to re-enter the workforce, like there
Mhm.
are a lot of complexities. So
Yeah.
either way is going to be so hard. You need to make
Mhm.
sure that they have made that decision on their own about which hard direction they want to go. Just
Right.
support them while they work through it because it might take them a long time to really come to a place where they have peace one way or the other.
Right. And the church could, one thing that, as I'm hearing you talk about the financial piece, could work with the victim on like coming to a better understanding of finances, like making a financial plan. There's some really practical things that churches can do, um, that aren't making the decision for them, but providing them the support and resources as they identify their barriers to leaving, right? Maybe it's housing, maybe it's other safety concerns, maybe it's financial independence, and as they start to identify those barriers to leaving, those are really good things to keep the radar up for, because then the church can say, well, what if someone from the church has an Airbnb, and would be willing to rent that out to you at a particular reduced fee. And what if we could help you create a budget? And then if you can, support them through navigating those barriers, then that person might feel, okay, I feel a little safer to make a decision. But and those who work in the field of DV know this too. One of the most dangerous times for a person in these scenarios is when they're trying to leave um,
Mhm.
an abusive relationship. And so it's just really important to collaborate with professionals and understanding those risks before we unwittingly put someone in a more harmful situation than they even are.
100%. Yes, because the reality is also that they are in a risky situation. When we talk about agency, something else I would
Mhm.
say is is when we're talking about giving the victim as many choices as possible, that includes who knows about their story, how much they know, when they're told,
Mhm.
what they're told. Like, because when we think about the implications of abuse, especially if they're still in that relationship, a good example is I heard of a story where someone told a pastor that they were going through abuse. They disclosed abuse in their relationship. The pastor was friends with the husband, the spouse, immediately went and confronted him on it. That's so
Mhm.
dangerous. That's so
Mhm.
dangerous
Mhm.
for that victim because that husband's going to go home and it's going to come out on her. And
Mhm.
so when we think about agency too, a lot of it is how do we make sure that they have the time and the space to plan for what the fallout might be for any step moving forward. And they're going to be the person who knows best what's safe for them at any given time.
Mhm.
Also, I thought a great little tool that I use for trainings when we're talking about churches and sort of
Mhm.
practical tools that they can use for supporting victims or survivors is Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yes.
Mhm. So if you
Mhm.
Google it, you'll see, there's the different stack of needs that people have, and the very bottom one is physical need. So thinking, how can we support them physically with food, with shelter,
Mhm.
maybe financially. The second one is safety. And so how can we help them feel safe both inside of the church context? How can we provide a safe place for healing? But also, how can we help them identify what feels unsafe in their home life and then address some of those needs? Um,
Yeah.
and this is actually an interesting one too, because I think when people don't feel physically safe, if their financial needs are still being met, a lot of times they'll stay because financial need is more necessary than safety
Yes.
at the hierarchy. Um,
Great
the
point.
one after that is social and belonging. This is like your community aspect the church can meet. How can we make sure they're not falling through the cracks? This is a big
Mm.
one I hear, especially for female survivors that may have divorced. It's a lot of times they sort of like the church just sort of loses them after the divorce happens. And so
Mm.
recognizing they need long-term support, how can we make sure that they don't get lost in the shuffle of people? And then esteem, so understanding um, their value, their worth, reinforcing their identity through scripture, combating some of those lies they've maybe been told in their relationship about their value, and then
Mm.
self-actualization. And that's really this like, what's your purpose? This is the gospel. This is something the church can uniquely offer. And then how can we help plug you in to places that utilize your spiritual giftings, that utilize your personal strengths so that you recognize you're more
Yeah.
than just a victim or survivor, that you still
Mm.
have a purpose and a use and a place.
Yes. Mm. That's so good. When we think about, we've been talking a little bit about the issue overall and then the church and like some of the things that make addressing this in faith communities really challenging. I know that there's possibly also some folks here watching this who are kind of trying to work through in their own marriages and partnerships, um what do what do I need to be on the lookout for? Maybe some folks are concerned about some behaviors they're noticing, or people have said, hey, I'm really concerned for you because XYZ is what I see, happening. Do you have a good resource we could point them to kind of think about and assess like what's going on? What are some things I need to be thinking through? Because, for people in these relationships, there can be a real sense of denial or also just a sense of I've never had anybody actually tell me that this is abuse before, that it could be, and I don't really know how to frame or understand what's happening here. So what do you recommend? What resources would you recommend for them?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to validate that abuse is really confusing and
Mm. Mm.
that someone who uses abusive behaviors is also more than those abusive behaviors. They are a full dimensional person. And and so that can make it hard. I have a podcast with survivors that share their stories. And
Mm.
one of them recently had said, 70 or 80% of the time my marriage was really great, but the 20 to 30% that it wasn't, it was really brutal. And so
Mm.
recognizing that relationships where abuse is happening can often feel sort of like this wave pattern where there's these really high highs and these really low lows. So it's not always clear cut. It's not always just what we imagine abuse to look like.
Mm.
Some of the resources, as far as trying to navigate or sort of discern if these patterns or behaviors are happening in your relationship, one of the big ones I would say is we have a free downloadable relationship inventory that's available on our website. So that's certainly something that you could access that goes through a series of questions that aren't yes and no. They have a gradient for them for you to sort of
Mm.
determine how many of these behaviors are showing up in my relationship. How often are they showing up?
Mm.
Um, Leslie Vernick's book, The Emotionally Destructive Marriage, also has a similar inventory in it, and it does a nice job of sort of navigating the line between when a marriage has become emotionally destructive. What does it mean to come to terms with that? What should my response be inside of that marriage? What if I'm not ready to leave or don't want to leave? What if I am ready to leave? So it sort of gives you that broad spectrum. It's very practical. She has a lot of online resources as well that could be helpful.
Mm. And these resources are both, geared toward either men and women as well.
Yeah, mine is gender neutral
Okay.
because of the continued research from the CDC that
Yes.
anyone can be a victim. It's almost statistically like not that different. Um, I keep all of my stuff pretty neutral.
Yeah.
I talk about gendered violence on occasion, but in the context of gendered violence,
Right.
Leslie Vernick's is more towards women.
Right. I did remember that. I think about some of her work, but this similar dynamics applicable, either way. So,
Mhm, mhm.
and do you have a particular guide, maybe in the resources tab on your website, or something in some of your trainings where you work specifically with, helping the church understand, like, here are some very concrete next steps when a disclosure is made or when we're navigating this, that folks can access?
Yeah, so the resources page on my website is a great place to look. I also would highly suggest picking up my book. The ebook version of it is pretty cheap, I think, on Amazon. It's called Ready Refuge. We can drop that in the link as well, or it's available on my website. But I specifically wrote that to be a concrete guide. I mean, it is like
Excellent.
designed to be a step by step, like someone has disclosed to you, here is what you need to think about. Here are what those next steps are. So that's a great resource there. But I would say if you're in doubt and you're a church leader dealing with this issue right now, the biggest thing would be um, consent, 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 consent,
Mm.
consent. Just constantly
One
ask
more
that
time. One more time.
consent.
Okay.
Ask that victim, ask that victim what feels safe for them
Yeah.
next. And
Yeah.
I'll make a little tick on this one real quick too, because I think a very common thing I'm hearing a lot right now from churches is when an
Mm,
elder board is dealing with it, especially an elder board that is all male, they
mm,
often have a
mm,
meeting with a victim to like understand the situation, and that's not a bad thing.
mhm.
Allow that victim to bring in other people to support
Yes.
into that meeting so it doesn't feel like
Yes.
they're being grilled, especially if it is a female victim and like,
Mm,
eight men sitting across from them. If they've been abused by a man, that can already feel like a wildly intimidating situation. Um,
yes.
so there's my sidebar on that just because I've been hearing
Mhm.
about that situation happening frequently.
No, that's incredibly helpful, practical suggestion. And, when we talk about the 6 principles of trauma-informed care, one of the ways of establishing safety and transparency and trustworthiness is, like, let's reduce the number of surprises, right? Let's make sure we know who's going to be at these meetings and these conversations, and do what we can to offer that safety. Of course, the only person who can determine it's safe is the person who needs to feel safe, right? But overall, just making sure that we're thinking through, what might this person need to feel safe in this environment to share with us what they need to share, in their timing. Absolutely. Well, Hannah, I know that we're coming to the end of our time, and it's been such a great conversation. I'm going to put the info at House of Faith and Freedom email address in the chat in case anyone wants to reach out about any other resources or questions. But I'm wondering if a way that we could maybe close out is for you to just share with us a little bit about a situation where you saw the church show up really well for someone who experienced intimate partner violence.
Sure. So I recently had a church invite me in. It was kind of a non-traditional training. So we did like a setup where it was 30 minutes for me to talk about abuse in a faith context. And then we had a victim witness coordinator talking about what it looks like when someone calls 911 and it's
Mm,
a criminal case and what that fallout looks like. And then we had someone else from our local DV agency talking about the resources they provide. So sort of this threefold, we each had 20, 30 minutes to talk. Um,
mm,
and this was at a church that I don't think had had any previous training on abuse. And one of the things that was very interesting is as I presented, just our understanding of what intimate partner violence is, what behaviors are considered abusive behaviors, especially psychologically.
mm,
Um, there was someone who was in that training who had been a staff member at that church that ended up coming forward and disclosing that her marriage was abusive, and she had never realized that the things she was suffering under were abusive before. And
mm,
some of those included like marital rape. They were fairly
mm,
severe, but they were things she just didn't have a context to understand.
mm,
So this was kind of a bombshell inside of that church. Her family was pretty involved, including her spouse, and they handled it really, really gracefully. They connected her to me as an advocate to talk through some of the complexities of her situation. She ended up going through a violent incident as she was in the process of leaving
mm,
that involved a firearm. And so they were able to walk through her and advising to call 911 because it was a criminal case and a safety concern. They helped make sure she had somewhere safe to go. because she was employed by the church, this also meant that there was a safety concern for the church. So the
Mm,
way to like come around and involve the safety and security around the church, they asked him to leave. And at the same time, he was sending in all these anonymous requests, prayer requests that were very long and trying to
mm,
garner sympathy and going to different pastors to try to tell a different story. And they were really good about communicating as a team about what was going on and about the behaviors that were unacceptable. And anyway, we're several years out from that now, and they've walked very graciously with her through
mm,
that entire process, through the divorce process. I think they've paid for some of her counseling. Like they've done a
mm,
really lovely job.
mm,
And that was encouraging because it could have been a moment of a lot of denial for them.
mm,
And instead they saw it as an opportunity to come around her. So
mm. Hannah, thank you for sharing that and for your time here today and all of the wealth of knowledge and information that you've shared with us. We have put the link to your website and your resource tab and your email address in the chat. So if anyone watching or listening would like to get in touch with House of Faith and Freedom, explore those resources, follow up with questions, have Hannah come in and do training, all of those, all of that information is available to you through those links and resources. So Hannah, thanks for being with us today. And thanks to everyone for tuning in and for being a part of this conversation by learning. And we hope that there will be some helpful resources that you'll find both in the information shared today and in the links provided in the chat. So thanks so much, Hannah, for being here with us.
thank you guys so much for having me.
For you are